Welcome to Freaky Fridays. Today's video is a follow-up from the Tales of Amos Humiston. If you saw the video already, you know that in a way Amos was responsible for the first orphanage here in Gettysburg. So we finished with that story, and now we're going to start a new story of the orphanage. The tale of a new matron taking over and all the horrid events that happened in the orphanage. They are all true. They have all been documented in Adams County history, and it is a very, very sad tale. So please relax and enjoy the story. Philinda Humiston got married to Asa Barnes in 1869 in the orphanage in Gettysburg. They wanted all their friends and family to be there before they left for Massachusetts, so they had the wedding ceremony right in the orphanage. And they said their goodbyes, and now it was time to get a new matron. A Dr. Barnes suggested a woman named Rosa Carmichael. She was from Philadelphia, and he vouched for her, saying that she was a good person and she would be able to do the job, which Philinda did so expertly. Rosa Carmichael took over, and the orphanage took on a new face, you might say. The children didn't seem like they were happy anymore. They were kind of walking around gloomy and sad. They didn't look as healthy. And life there just wasn't what it was under Philinda's care. Some of the children of the orphanage would go over to Georgia McClellan's house. Georgia loved the children, and she lived where the Jenny Wade house is today. She lived on one side of the duplex, and Georgia actually was Jenny Wade's sister. And Georgia had a little boy, and she welcomed the kids from the orphanage. Many times she would bake them cookies and just sit outside and talk, and she began to notice a difference in the children too, ever since Rosa Carmichael took over. Now, the ghost tour company that I used to work for used both the orphanage and the Jenny Wade house as part of their tours. We would go to one of the houses at first, and then go out on the streets and walk around and tell stories outside as well. Now, for a ghost tour in the orphanage, what we would do was take the crowd over. Usually on some of my tours, I had around 12 people, like during the week, but on the weekends it would go up to as many as 24. So it got quite busy there. The orphanage is right on Baltimore Street in Gettysburg. It's across from the bus tour center rather, and when you walk into a gift shop, and then the guide takes you downstairs into the basement, and that's where the tour is held. When you walk down the steps, there are benches down there for people to sit on, and it's a normal basement, just like yours. It has a furnace in it and a water tank, that kind of thing. There are some toys scattered around down there, like baby dolls and baseballs and that kind of thing. And it's very dark. Towards the rear of the basement is a little hallway, and it goes back to what is called the dungeon. Now, the dungeon is probably 5 by 8, a little room 5 by 8, and it's only around 4 feet high. So you really have to bend over to get down in there. It's very uncomfortable, especially if you have a bad back, but children have no problem going back there. It is said that when kids, had an infraction of the rules of the orphanage, that Rosa Carmichael would make them go back into the dungeon, and she would chain them to the wall with shackles. As horrible as this sounds, it has been known to be absolutely true. People on the tours go back into the dungeon. They crawl back there and they take photos. And very often there are entities on these photos, and some things can't be made out at all. Other ones are just mist and swirls. Sometimes you can make out an actual face. It's very, very scary down there. When I used to give my tours, I would stand in front of the people who were sitting on the benches and tell them the story of Rosa Carmichael and the orphans and how she treated them. She really did pick on two of the orphans especially. One was Bella Hunter, and the other one was a little boy named Willie. And we'll talk about Bella Hunter first. Poor Bella, she had a rough life even before she came to the orphanage. She was abused and turned out onto the streets and just had a hard life. And they thought when they brought her to Gettysburg that life would be good for her. And it was while Felinda was the matron. But as soon as Rosa took over, Rosa actually made Bella her slave, her personal slave. It is said that Bella had to sleep on the floor beside Rosa's bed at night. And one day Bella had a tear in her dress, and Rosa made Bella wear boys' clothing for like 6 weeks as punishment. Now, for that time period, this was a terrible, terrible thing to do to a young Victorian girl. I mean, they were all about dresses and being fancy and prim and proper. So to be, in a boy's attire, it really disturbed Bella, and people made fun of her, and it was indeed a very bad torture. Rosa was unrelenting on Bella, and she watched her like a hawk, and anything she did, she added more time to her punishments. The little boy Willie, from what I know, he was around 7 years old, and he was a frail little guy, and he wasn't a bad boy at all, but when he did something bad, he got locked in the outhouse overnight. It didn't matter if it was freezing cold out. This was one of Rosa's favorite tortures for the kids. She would also do things like fill up a barrel of water and make the child go into the water like chest high and stay there. It didn't matter how cold it was or if they could stand up anymore or not. This woman was actually horrible to these children. Georgia McClellan began to see how Willie was suffering. She knew something was going on, but the children would not talk to her because they were so afraid of Rosa that they wouldn't utter a peep against her. One day, Willie ended up missing. And when confronted by the authorities, Rosa said, "Oh, he probably ran away. He didn't like it here, and he never behaved anyway." It is thought that Rosa locked Willie in an outhouse, and Willie just passed away from the cold and, being hungry. They think she buried him somewhere around the old Gettysburg village up there, but it has never been proven and has never been known for sure exactly what happened to Willie. Things kept happening at the orphanage, and at the time the orphanage was under the supervision of the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic. For some reason they were chosen to be stewards of the place, and they had a building on Middle Street in town, and they would send inspectors to the orphanage and question everything about what was going on. They noticed the food wasn't as good as it used to be, the clothing for the kids, even the education was suffering. They started to investigate Rosa Carmichael, and things really took a turn for the worse. She denied everything. She created so many lies, and funding for the orphanage began to suffer because the patrons and the children in Sunday schools were questioning whether it was a good place for the kids to be or not. When the funding began to suffer, the GAR got involved, and they pressed charges against Rosa Carmichael. She flatly denied any threat, any abuse that she did to the kids. Dr. Bourne stood up for her, and he said no, she would never do that kind of thing. And people didn't understand why Dr. Bourne would stand for her. He just didn't understand. They just didn't understand what was going on between the two of them. How could this man who cared so much about the orphans in the beginning turn against them now when they really needed him? Rosa ended up going to court, the Adams County Courthouse, and having a trial. They could not find enough evidence to positively prove her guilty, but they wanted her out of the orphanage. So they charged her $20 and told her that she had to leave town. The orphanage was suffering. Like I said, they weren't getting money in because of what Rosa did and because of the stigma on the orphanage now. So she did leave the orphanage, and she paid her fine. Nobody knows where she went or whatever happened to her, but they were certainly glad to be rid of her, especially people like Bella, and I'm sure Willie too. Because of the stigma placed on the orphanage, it had to close. And 11 years from when it started, the doors finally closed, and they sent the children to other orphanages nearby states. What a sad story. Something that started out so positive and happy just got ruined by one person who had a sick mind. In the 1950s, a man named Charlie Weaver bought the orphanage, and I'm sure some of you may know who this guy is. Charlie Weaver was on Hee Haw, and he was on Hollywood Squares. His real name is Cliff Arquette, and he is the father of Roseanne Arquette and David Arquette, the actors. He bought the orphanage and turned it into a soldier's museum. He loved the Civil War and everything about it, so he wanted a museum for the soldiers, and that's what he did. When he heard the story about Rosa Carmichael and how she treated the children, he told them that he wanted to have a dungeon on the first floor, to make a mock-up of the dungeon as it was in the basement, the same dimensions, and have children down in there. So the name of Rosa Carmichael would be heard over and over again, and how she tortured the children. To this day, there is a dungeon right off of the gift shop, and you can see, little dolls down in there and children, and they're chained to the wall. Charlie Weaver was a good guy, and he didn't want the orphanage to have a bad name throughout all those years. Now, I can tell you as a ghost tour guide that many, many things have happened down in that basement. The toys I was telling you about, some people would see them move, the ball would start to roll for no apparent reason. The toys would move across the table. People would get images on their cameras and they couldn't make them out. Some of them were scary faces. Some of them were just tricks of light. And I used to bring my dowsing rods with me when I would give a tour. And I would let people in the audience use my dowsing rods to see if they could communicate with any of the spirits who lingered in the basement. Sure enough, one night I was using my dowsing rods and holding them out, as you do. The rods crossed over and hit me in the shoulders really hard. I've never had this happen before. So whoever was in the basement was trying hard to let me know that they were there and they wanted attention. Dowsing rods can give you answers. They can tell you yes or no if you formulate the question in a way that they can say yes or no. For example, I would say, is Rosa Carmichael with us tonight? And if the rods crossed, that would be an affirmative answer. If they went apart, then that means no. People really enjoyed it when I let them use the dowsing rods, and they felt like they could too could communicate with the spirits. That was really something. That basement is very haunted, is very scary, and you know, if you have the chance, check out the tour, because I'm sure they're still saying the same stories and talking about the same things. But you know, the orphanage is definitely one of the most haunted places in Gettysburg. I thank you for joining me on this Freaky Friday. I hope you enjoyed this tour, and you take care, and I'll see you next time, okay? See ya. Bye-bye.